This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the newest edition in the Compliance Podcast Network. My latest podcast, Compliance and Coronavirus. As the voice of compliance, I wanted to start a podcast which will help bring both clarity and sanity to the field of compliance, the compliance practitioner, and indeed the compliance profession during this worldwide health and healthcare crisis. Taking up a variety of topics as diverse as working from home to sporting events, to the role of the board of directors, to crisis management, to the role of supply chains. We will look at all of these in this podcast. If you have a topic you'd like covered on compliance and coronavirus, please let me know. I'd be happy to do a podcast on it. We will post on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 9 a.m. Central Time for the foreseeable future as we navigate our way through this incredible crisis. First, a word about our sponsor, SAI Global. With the coronavirus and COVID-19 pandemic continuing to change rapidly, trust and integrity are paramount to business continuity preparedness. SAI Global is here to help compliance and risk professionals facing these challenges, including unprecedented business impacts from employee well-being to disrupted supply chains. SAI 360 is a cloud-first software and modern ethics and compliance learning platform designed to help you navigate risk from every perspective. To learn more about how you can protect your business operations and workforce during these uncertain times, visit saiglobal.com/risk for free resources, expert guidance, and industry-leading technology. Thanks again to SAI Global for sponsoring this most important podcast. In this episode, I have Ryan Wilkins from the Stradling Law Firm. Ryan is a partner and practices in corporate governance, and we take a look at some of the issues that have come up for corporate governance around the coronavirus crisis and the filings public companies need to do with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and today I have with me Ryan Wilkins. And Ryan is with the Stradling Law Firm in California. We're going to take a look at Ryan's specific area, or at least one of his areas of practice, leading the firm's corporate and securities law practice and public company practice group. So, Ryan, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you having me.
So, Ryan, I would just like to jump right into how has the coronavirus health crisis impacted corporate governance, and what sort of advice are you initially giving your clients at this point?
So the coronavirus pandemic has obviously impacted businesses, across geographies and across industries. I mean, literally every business in the United States is focused on this issue at this time. And so I think that the number one thing is making sure that management teams are actively discussing these issues, being as transparent with one another as possible, and bringing the board of directors into the conversations kind of at every level. What we're seeing is there are impacts across the business, whether from supply chain impact, impact on demand, changes to the way that employees are having to work, and a number of other issues. And so these are issues that really are impacting businesses across the spectrum, and it's critically important that the board of directors and the management team be focused on these issues at this time.
Ryan, one thing that's always either intrigued me or interested me or concerned me, depending on the situation, is about succession planning. And what do you do when you have a senior manager, a CEO, or someone else at a high level of an organization who becomes incapacitated due to illness? And then you have to temper that with, of course, privacy rights, healthcare privacy rights, HIPAA, and all of a plethora of other rules and regulations. But I wanted to ask what advice, or perhaps better, what are you seeing around succession plans and succession planning being reviewed, updated, or is that a risk factor that companies are actually talking about in filings now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different layers to that question. Thinking mostly about public companies for a moment, there's an interesting question that arises around at what point would a company have an obligation to say something to the investment community in the event that a key manager was to become sick, whether from coronavirus or something else. And there's sort of different schools of thought around that. On the one hand, there's nothing in the SEC rules or the stock exchange rules that would require an immediate disclosure around somebody becoming ill. However, I think companies have to always be thinking about whether what they know about their own workforce and their own management team is material and needs to be disclosed to investors generally. There are, for example, some NYSE rules that require disclosure of material developments without really defining what that means. And so a company that's traded on the NYSE would have to think about whether to make active disclosure around somebody becoming ill. Separate from that, if a company is considering engaging in securities transactions, accessing the market, either by issuing securities in a public offering or repurchasing securities because the company believes that they are the securities are undervalued at the moment and they want to deploy cash to repurchase those securities. Companies have a heightened duty of disclosure in those contexts and would really have to think about whether to make a disclosure with respect to a manager that has become ill, especially if it's the CEO, CFO, or another key manager. So I think part of the issue is whether and when to make disclosure, and those are facts and circumstances determinations that would have to be thought through very carefully with counsel. I think another aspect of the question is with regard to changes to governance policies and succession planning. I think that there's been a push in recent years for more focus around succession planning, and so hopefully many of the larger public companies have given some thought to this and have plans in place. But certainly, to the extent that companies have the bandwidth at the moment to be focused on succession planning and making sure that they do have a plan in place in the event one of the senior executives was to become ill, that should absolutely be a focus and part of the overall enterprise risk management focus that the board and the management team should have right now.
Ryan, are there any new or additional reporting obligations other than those we've talked about due to material risk from coronavirus or perhaps the attendant economic fallout?
There aren't really any new legal reporting requirements. The SEC has issued some guidance here very recently. I believe it was just a couple days ago. They came out with some new guidance around disclosures in management discussion and analysis, or MD&A, sections of a 10K and a 10Q. And effectively, they are asking issuers to very carefully consider the overall impacts of the coronavirus epidemic on the businesses, not just thinking about it in terms of whether a risk factor has to be added or not, but thinking about it in terms of risk factor disclosure, updates to the business section, and perhaps most importantly, updates to the MD&A section. And in that guidance, the SEC poses a couple dozen questions to help elicit responses from issuers. And I think it's clear from looking at that guidance, you're not expected to actually answer all of those questions. But I think it's a good framework for thinking about how you might provide new responsive information in light of how the epidemic is impacting the company. So to the extent that issuers are in the process of preparing what's probably a 10Q filing for the first quarter for those companies that are 12/31 fiscal year end, I certainly would encourage them to go and look at the SEC guidance and really sit down and look at those questions and think about where the company may be able to provide information in response to those sorts of questions. So again, there isn't really new guidance in terms of new legal requirements. They haven't actually modified what the requirements for MD&A are, but there is some new guidance which is helpful for thinking about how to prepare MD&A in this context.
So regarding the economic situation we find ourselves in now, even without the health crisis, how would you think the SEC is going to view companies' financial reporting obligations, their reporting obligations, looking at risk factors in the future, or is it just really business as usual in terms of the standards the SEC will hold companies to on financial reporting obligations?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, the SEC has come out now with a couple different releases and a couple different orders indicating that it understands it's going to be more difficult to comply with SEC reporting obligations during this time. They initially issued an order, I believe it was on March 4th, that allowed companies that had filings that were due, I believe it was from March 1st through April 30th, to be able to delay those filings for up to 45 days. They have since come out with updated guidance on March 25th, indicating that they will now allow companies that have filings due on or by July 1st to take advantage of this guidance. And effectively what the guidance does is it says that you can take advantage of a 45-day extension to make filings, whether it's a 10K, a 10Q, a proxy statement, or certain other SEC filings, so long as you inform the market that you intend to do so by filing an 8K. That 8K has to be filed no later than the filing due date, the original filing due date for whatever SEC filing is at issue. And you have to make a basic statement about the reason that you are delaying the filing and, if appropriate, provide risk factor disclosure around the impacts of coronavirus on your business. But it's a fairly simple filing to make if, in fact, you want to take advantage of it. And so on the one hand, the SEC is acknowledging the difficulty of making the timely filings, the difficulty of interacting with auditors or working with remote work staff. And so it's making this filing accommodation available, which I think is helpful to certain issuers. On the other hand, we're not really seeing any changes in the standards that are going to apply to SEC filings. There's nothing in the new rules or the guidance that would suggest that there's a lesser standard or a lesser bar that has to be met. And so I think the SEC's perspective on this is they're willing to give more time where it's necessary for particular issues needed, but they are not necessarily going to be changing the way they look at the filings. And in fact, in these various orders that the SEC has issued, they have admonished companies to make sure that they're still making transparent disclosure to investors. They're telling issuers to be careful before they go and access the capital markets by issuing securities or by repurchasing shares or allowing officers and directors to trade. They're sort of reminding folks that it's important that companies disclose all material non-public information to the market in its filings before it undertakes transactions in the securities. And so I think the bar is still very much the same, just with some of the filing deadlines being moved.
Ryan, are you, how are you counseling clients in terms of meeting the current deadlines or pre-existing deadlines or meeting the amended deadlines? Is it really a company by company analysis, or are you counseling one way or the other?
It's really a company by company analysis. I think that whether a company is going to need to take advantage of these potentially extended deadlines is a function of their own work staff and how well they're working remotely. In some cases, how sophisticated the client is, how long it's been a public reporting company. A company that's a recent IPO issuer may have a harder time complying than one that's an established, long-time SEC reporting company, for example. Another factor that would weigh in on it is the extent to which the company's business has been impacted. Many companies are not necessarily struggling to make filings because of staffing issues or things of that nature. That they're struggling to make filings because they're not really sure what to say. They're still trying to figure out what the supply chain impacts are. They're trying to figure out how productive their workforce is going to be. They're trying to figure out how much demand is really being impacted in various geographic regions, and obviously crafting their disclosures accordingly. So I think it's more about getting to a point where the company feels comfortable with making good disclosures rather than taking advantage of the extended deadline because of staffing needs. But I think that those considerations are going to have to be undertaken on a case-by-case basis.
Ryan, pivoting a little bit, I was wondering, are you hearing a consistent type of question from your clients, or is everyone really in a kind of a wait and see mode on how things around corporate governance might shake out, or are you suggesting people be more proactive during this time of coronavirus crisis?
The questions that we're receiving most frequently now are what I would characterize as disclosure questions. Certainly, there's some overlap with disclosure and corporate governance, but far and away, the questions that I'm getting most regularly now from my GCs and from my CFOs is what sort of additional disclosures should we be making? How far should we be taking the disclosures? Should we be making interim disclosures? Generally speaking, companies that aren't involved in securities transactions, such as issuing securities in a capital markets transaction or repurchasing shares, don't have an active and ongoing disclosure obligation, or at least that's the traditional view. You really only have to make filings that are required under the securities laws, such as the 10K, the 10Q, and the 8K filings. And so that's sort of the starting point is you don't need to go to the market and make disclosure unless you're required to by a particular reporting obligation. But nonetheless, there are numerous considerations involved with perhaps making interim disclosures, coming to the market sooner and talking about the impacts of the COVID epidemic on the business. One reason to do that is to just provide good disclosure to the market and reputational reasons, with investors and with market participants, just to let folks know that you're paying attention and that you're going to be actively providing disclosure. Another reason to provide that interim disclosure might be to cleanse the company of material non-public information, get the information into the market, and allow the company to actively access the market or allow officers and directors to trade in securities. And so really thinking through these disclosure issues is pretty complicated. It's very specific to individual clients and individual industries. And again, whether the company is just kind of on its normal disclosure cadence or whether it's actually intending to be in the market trading in securities right now or allowing its officers and directors to be trading. So I think that's probably the number one question that I'm receiving. And then tangential to that would be questions around what to do with changing guidance. Many companies give some form of guidance, whether it's on an annual basis or a quarterly basis, whether it's just revenue or going further down the income statement to things like EBITDA and EPS. Obviously, companies that have given guidance earlier this year, oftentimes as part of their 10K filing, if they're a 1231 company, they are very much reconsidering that guidance, and so thinking through whether to change guidance, whether to revoke that guidance completely as compared to modifying the guidance or taking a wait and see approach are things that we're getting questions about very regularly.
Ron, if I could turn to the Stradling Law Firm just for a moment. You guys have put together, I think, a fabulous resource entitled the COVID-19 Client Service Resource Center. I was wondering if you could just say a few words about that effort.
Yeah, happy to do so. So a couple of weeks ago, as we realized, along with many other firms, that this epidemic was becoming global and very significant for our country and for our individual clients, we put together a task force here at the firm. The task force includes subject matter experts in areas such as employment law, privacy, securities reporting, and other areas. And so with the help of that task force, we now have a portion of our webpage that has some dedicated resources, not only providing some contact information, but also providing a number of client alerts. I think at this point we have a half dozen or so client alerts on various topics, and we are in the process of providing additional client alerts on literally a daily basis as things change. And so it's a pretty good resource, and I would encourage folks to go and check it out.
And I'm not only going to encourage them to do so, but I want to actually thank you guys for putting together really one of the top resources. And as you suggest, it is changing, if not on an hourly basis, sometimes daily. And you guys are doing a great job in putting out updated guidance. So on behalf of the consuming public, thank you for doing that. Ryan, if we could end by asking if listeners wanted more information on you or the firm, how could they find out?
I'd be happy to have folks contact me directly. My direct dial at the law firm, which will forward to my mobile number, is 949-725-4115. And you can also access me by going to our website, which is www.sycr.com. And be happy to chat with anybody about any questions they may have about any of the topics covered during the podcast or any other related topics.
Ryan, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yep. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance and Coronavirus. If you have any questions or you have a topic you would like explored on this podcast, please shoot me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Also, as a call to action, I would ask if you could to please tell one of your friends about the podcast so we can spread the word out about the newest podcast on the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, if you would leave us a rating on iTunes or a review, it would greatly help get the word out about this most important podcast over the next several months. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join me for our next episode of Compliance and Coronavirus. This podcast is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.